About 1 in 2 of us will suffer mental illness at some point in our lives. And mental illness is under-recognised, poorly treated and misunderstood, which leaves people who suffer from it feeling isolated and sometimes even ashamed. Things could be a lot better if we all knew more about mental illness, how to recognise it, and what to do with our family, colleagues and friends if we recognise it in them. It could actually save a life and certainly alleviate pain. Some people call this mental health first aid. Karen Carey has the story.
I can't understand why it is that I go to somebody and I'm smiling and I'm saying I'm fine, and I think, can't you see what's written on my face? So I'm actually, the image I'm giving out is, gosh, you know, how are you today? And everything's fine. Inside I'm thinking, I want to kill myself. Can't you see that?
I mean, they can do their day-to-day activities and they can have a veneer of being completely in control, but inside they feel like they're a changed person and nobody can see it. They feel an enormous pain, and a common response is that they go inside themselves. So they cease to be as able to go out and actually seek help. So it feels like pain. In fact, one of the first studies we did showed that people will take aspirin and paracetamol for depression because of the ache and pain that they actually have.
That's exactly right. What I've done several times is I've put a Band-Aid on my forehead. And people have said, what's wrong? And I've said, I hurt on the inside. So you can't describe that pain. It's like self-harm. You can't describe the busyness of your head. Your head is taken over by this intensity. And it's not a headache. It's a headache of the heart. That's what I call it.
No one should have to put a Band-Aid on their head to show when they need help for a mental illness. Most of us know what to do when someone injures themselves or has chest pain, but very few of us know what to do when the problem is psychological. The first step in mental health first aid is to recognise when someone is suffering.
I mean, I don't think it's that easy to tell the difference between whether somebody's really suffering or not, because again it goes back to that keeping it in your heart. If you know somebody very well who has depression, for example, you can actually start to tell, because they do change from what they were like, but particularly they start to withdraw, and I think that's a critical sign in your children or in your friends, that they actually start to withdraw and they're not normally like that.
And the first thing for me is when I stop answering the phone, then emails, then the door, and it goes in that. So when I start doing that, I think I'm not right.
Depression is one of the commonest mental illnesses, and whilst it causes a lot of pain, suicide is the big risk. Knowing someone's at risk of suicide can be daunting if you're the bystander, but knowing what to do can be even more life-saving than CPR.
The thing with suicide, it comes, from my experience, it comes almost like a bell curve, and it starts to build up to quite a high crescendo.
We know that there are risk factors such as depression and anxiety, but some more recent evidence suggests that it's more complicated than that. So, for example, a new theory around the psychology of suicide suggests that not only do you have to have the feelings of despair, hopelessness, feeling like you're a burden on your friends and your family, but you also have to have inherent within your psychology the capacity to harm yourself. And if you think about it, harming yourself is something that we don't really like to do. I mean, we don't engage in aversive behaviour. So you have to have actually overcome certain barriers in order to be able to actually go that next step and to try and take your own life. So the predictors of that are related to things like childhood trauma, exposure to death, exposure to medical procedures, anything that sort of breaks down the barriers and increases a person's understanding of how they actually might take their own life.
While mental health first aid is usually for lay people, sometimes health professionals could do with a lesson or two.
Going to our local emergency department, which is about an hour away in Perth, and it takes about 2 hours for me to get out the car, because you have all those things that bubble up. I'm going to look silly, I'm going to die while I'm in there. You had to sort of talk quite loudly to the old, to the lady through the screen. So I'd sort of have to say, look, I suffer depression and I'm suicidal. about 1 o'clock in the morning, and she said to me, well, we don't have facilities for people like you. You're going to have to go up to Perth. And so I sort of apologised for being there, and I went out and got in the car and gave it some thought and thought, I don't know if I'm getting to number 10, and I was getting scared. So I did drive the outer Perth, and I went to one of our major hospitals. And again, it took about half an hour to get out the car this time, because by then I was really, really frightened. The whole way up on the freeway, I had been looking at big posts, big trucks. And I got there, and I did get into the emergency department, and I went through the rigmarole again, and I have depression, I'm feeling suicidal. And the lady said to me, how bad are you? Because we have to bring somebody in to admit you if you from the mental health section. So how bad are you? And I said, well, look, actually, I'm not that bad. I was quite embarrassed by this stage. I said, look, I'm not that bad, don't worry about it, and I left. And I went back out to the car and I sat there, and I was really panicking, but I thought, God, I can't wake up a psychiatrist. How bad would that be? How rude. So I actually got in the car and I drove to where I believed I was going to be safe, and someone was going to be looking at me, and I couldn't get away with anything, and I went to the Burswood Casino, and I sat on a chemo machine about 5 o'clock in the morning, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon it had passed, and I felt safe, and I drove home.
Many people have the thoughts that they're going to take their own life. Around about 10% of the population might think, I'd rather not be living now. But as you progress into closer and closer suicidal behaviour, it gets fewer and fewer people. So, for example, you might be asked how you thought you might try and kill yourself. Did you actually have plans for how it might occur, and so on? And the closer a person gets to that sort of report to a health professional, then the more and more they are likely to be at more and more risk to themselves.
The guidelines say there are 3 questions you can ask someone who's potentially suicidal. Have you thought about how you might do it? Have you thought about when you might do it? And have you taken any actions to procure the things that you would need to suicide? Now, there's 2 other factors that significantly increase the likelihood that someone will suicide. That's if there's drugs and alcohol involved, or if they've made a previous suicide attempt.
I think we've been given a fantastic compass called your gut. And if your gut says to you, something's not right with this person, that's when I believe you should have the guts to ask me, Deb, are you feeling suicidal? Are you feeling like you want to hurt yourself? I want to tell somebody. And quite often when I've told somebody, that brings it down a little bit. Not everybody's going to tell you, but for myself, it's like, you care enough to have asked, because I know it's harder for you to ask me than it is for me to answer. What I want is somebody to listen and not judge me. I want them to allow me to speak it without fear that they're going to call the police and throw me in a paddy wagon and send me off to the nut house. I don't want that. I want somebody to know. I want them to just listen first. But I want them to ask me the questions that will let me say what's inside. Nobody really wants to die, and we tend to give out these little messages, and we hope, it's almost like throwing a bottle in the ocean with help in it. We're hoping you'll notice.
Now, just a word of caution about mental health first aid. It doesn't turn you into a health professional, nor does it make you responsible for a person's actions. So if things don't go well, it's not your fault. All we can do is try.